Hello, hello, hello. I'm Uncle Game Boy, and these are my books? That's right, I'm not playing a game right now. I'm reading a book. I'm trying to do something good for the good people of Twitch. Spend all your days brain rotting and not learning a damn thing or doing anything with yourselves, but maybe with my help we can all improve our minds and grow as people on Twitch every now and then. I don't know. Maybe it's a crazy idea. Well, I'm gonna give it a shot anyway. This is Uncle Game Boy. That's I meant to say that. And this is Oliver Twist. This is a book by Charles Dickens. Um, some people who are saying, "Oh, you're trying to be cultured. Why are you reading a book that's for children?" It's like, no, this is not a book for children. This is one of the indelible classics of literature. This is in the canon of classical literature, I'll have you know. And you sound like a fucking Philistine saying something like that to me. So, without further ado, let's get into the book. How about? This is chapter 1 of Oliver Twist, a book written by Charles Dickens, a man from England who lived a long, long time ago. Among other public buildings in a certain town, which for many reasons it will be prudent to refrain from mentioning, it boasts of one which is common to most towns, great or small, to wit, a workhouse. And in this workhouse was born the item of mortality, whose name is prefixed to this book. For a long time after he was ushered into this world of sorrow and trouble by the parish surgeon, it remained a matter of considerable doubt whether the child would survive to bear any name at all, in which case it is somewhat more than probable that these memoirs would never have appeared, or, if they had, being comprised within a couple of pages, that they would have possessed the inestimable merit of being the most concise and faithful specimen of biography extant in the literature of any age or country. The fact is that there was considerable difficulty in inducing Oliver to take upon himself the office of respiration. Respiration, yes, that's correct. A troublesome practice. I know all too well how troublesome the practice of respiration is. A troublesome practice, but one which custom has rendered necessary to our easy existence. And for some time he lay gasping on the little flock mattress, rather unequally poised between this world and the next, the balance being decidedly in favor of the latter. Now, if during this brief period Oliver had been surrounded by careful grandmothers, anxious aunts, experienced nurses, and doctors of profound wisdom, he would most inevitably and indubitably have been killed in no time. There being nobody by, however, but a pauper old woman, who was rendered rather misty by an unwonted allowance of beer, and a parish surgeon who did such matters by contract, Oliver and nature fought out the point between them. The result was that, after a few struggles, Oliver breathed, sneezed, and proceeded to advertise to the inmates of the workhouse the fact of a new burden having been imposed upon the parish by setting up as loud a cry as could reasonably have been expected from a male infant who had not been possessed of that very useful appendage, a voice, for a much longer space of time than 3 minutes and a quarter. As Oliver gave this first proof of the free and proper action of his lungs, a lot of talk about lungs here. The patchwork coverlet, which was carelessly flung over the iron bedstead, rustled. The pale face of a young female was raised feebly from the pillow, and the faint voice imperfectly articulated the words, "Let me see the child and die." The surgeon had been sitting with his face turned toward the fire, giving the palms of his hands a warm and a rub alternately. But as the young woman spoke, he rose, and advancing to the bed's head, said with more kindness than might have been expected of him, "Oh, you must not talk about dying yet." "Lord bless her dear heart, no," interposed the nurse, hastily depositing in her pocket a green glass bottle, the contents of which she had been tasting in a corner with evident satisfaction. "Lord bless her dear heart. When she has lived as long as I have, sir, and had 13 children of her own, and all of 'em dead except 2, and them in the workers with me, she'll know better than to take on in that way, bless her dear heart. Think what it is to be a mother, there's a dear young lamb, do." Apparently, this consolatory perspective of a mother's prospects failed in producing its due effect. The patient shook her head and stretched out her hand towards the child. The surgeon deposited it in her arms. She imprinted her cold white lips passionately on its forehead, passed her hands over her face, gazed widely round, shuddered, fell back, and died. They chafed her breast, hands, and temples, but the blood had frozen forever. "It's all over, Miss Thungummy," said the surgeon at last. "Oh, poor dear, so it is," said the nurse, picking up the cork of the green bottle which had fallen out on the pillow as she stooped to take the child. "Poor dear. You needn't mind sending up to me if the child cries, nurse," said the surgeon, putting on his gloves with great deliberation. "It's very likely it will be troublesome. Give it a little gruel if it is." He put on his hat, and pausing by the bedside on his way to the door, added, "She was a good-looking girl, too. Where did she come from?" "She was brought here last night," replied the old woman. "She was found lying in the street. She had walked some distance, for her shoes were worn to pieces. But where she came from or where she was going to, nobody knows." The surgeon leant over the body and raised the left hand. "The old story," he said, shaking his head. "No wedding ring. I see. Good night." The medical gentleman walked away to dinner, and the nurse, having once more applied herself to the green bottle, sat down on a low chair before the fire and proceeded to dress the infant. Chapter 2. The parish authorities resolved that Oliver should be farmed, in quotations there, or in other words, that he should be dispatched to a branch workhouse some 3 miles off, where 20 or 30 other juvenile offenders against the poor law rolls about the floor all day, without the inconvenience of too much food or too much clothing, under the parental superintendence of an elderly female who received the culprits at and for the consideration of 7 pence halfpenny per small head per week. Holy shit, that was a long sentence. Wow. £7 halfpenny's worth per week is a good round diet for a child. A great deal may be got for 7 pence halfpenny, quite enough to overload its stomach and make it uncomfortable. The elderly female was a woman of wisdom and experience. She knew what was good for children, and she had a very accurate perception of what was good for herself. She appropriated the greater part of the weekly stipend for her own use, and co-signed the rising parochial generation to even a shorter allowance than was originally provided for them. Unfortunately, at the very moment when a child had contrived... Ooh, my internet's going bad. What's going on, honey? What's going on, honey? You okay? What's wrong, baby? Come on. I know it's unstable. What's going on here? Oh, there's nothing I can fucking do about it. It's nothing I can fucking do about it. Where were we? Where the fuck were we in this fucking book? Contrived is the smallest possible portion, weakest possible, but what the fuck? I'm a stingy lady. Where were we? Unfortunately, at the very moment when a child had contrived to exist upon the smallest possible portion of weakest possible food, it did perversely happen in 8.5 cases out of 10, either that it sickened from want and cold, or fell into the fire from neglect, Jesus Christ, or got half smothered by accident. In any one of which cases, the miserable little being was usually summoned into another world, and there gathered to the fathers it had never known in this. Jesus, man, why is the internet fucking up right now? Come on, baby. I'm like fucking not even doing anything. I'm playing a dang video I downloaded, and I'm just talking. Fucking, come on, honey. Come on. I know you got it in you. I know you got it in you. Just fucking work, please. Come on. Okay. I don't know why it's being like this. I don't know why it's being like, whatever. It's fine. You know. Who cares? Who cares? I'm reading Oliver Twist. Who gives a shit? Okay. Anyway, children are falling into the fire, and occasionally, when there was some more than usually interesting inquest upon a parish child, the jury would take it into their heads to ask troublesome questions, or the parishioners would rebulously affix their signatures to a remonstrance. But I think I said that right. But these impertinences were speedily checked by the evidence of the surgeon and the testimony of the beadle, the former of whom had always opened the body and found nothing inside, which was very probable indeed, and the latter of whom invariably swore whatever the parish wanted, which was very self-devotional. Besides, the board made periodical pilgrimages to the farm and always sent the beadle the day before to say where they were going. The children were neat and clean to behold when they went, and what more would the people have? It cannot be expected that this system of farming would produce any very extraordinary or luxuriant crop. Oliver Twist's 9th birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature and decidedly small in circumference. He was keeping it in the coal cellar with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen, who, after participating with him in a sound thrashing, had been locked up therein for atrociously presuming to be hungry, when Mrs. Mann, the good lady of the house, was unexpectedly startled by the apparition of Mr. Bumble, the beetle striving to undo the wicket of the garden gate. "Goodness gracious, is that you, Mr. Bumble, sir?" said Mrs. Mann, thrusting her head out of the window in well-affected ecstasies of joy. "Susan, take Oliver and them two brats upstairs and wash 'em directly. My heart alive, Mr. Bumble, how glad I am to see you, surely." What the fuck is with the internet right now? Honestly, come on, man. You can't cooperate with your buddy? We can't be friends in this life? You gotta fucking fight me tooth and nail at every turn? Trying to make everything difficult for me and make me look like a fucking fool on the internet in front of everybody? How dare you? I can only hope it gets better. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm trying to move the thing around. It's not fucking doing shit. It might be making it worse for all I can tell. Ah, holy hell. It just gets worse, and then you die. It's just the stupidest, fucking, most annoying bullshit that's ever happened in my entire life. And I think I'm just, I don't know. Gotta be more like Oliver, and get through the hard times. No matter how much you just want to fucking jump into the fucking streets of London and let a carriage run you over and a horse trampled the brains out of your body. You have to get through life just like Oliver Twist did. That's the lesson. You have to get through it even if the internet's awful for no fucking reason. And it probably looks awful when you watch your Twitch stream later, because you're the only one who fucking would ever watch this shit. Let's see if the sound worked okay, which I'm sure it won't, because the internet's fucking awful right now for some fucking reason. I'm trying to sit here and enjoy my book. And the gremlins are just getting in the way like they always do. Me and technology, I don't know what it is. We just don't get along. We always have problems. We can't figure things out. We never get along. We're always frustrated with one another. I think it's just the way it is. I think it's just the way it is. But damn, it makes you just want to die. It just makes you want to end it all. But no, you can't do that. You can't do that. You got to be more like Oliver Twist. And see, things will get better. The internet's apparently getting slightly better. Things will look up. You just got to keep going, just like Oliver did. Then things will be okay. That's the lesson. That's the lesson that this book has to impart upon me. If I can just get back to reading it and not let the shitty internet connection get me down. All right, what's going on here? What's going on? What's going on in this farm that he's working at? Good gracious, Mr. Bumble, sir. Now, Mr. Bumble was a fat man, and a choleric one, so instead of responding to this open-hearted salutation in a kindred spirit, he gave the little wicket a tremendous shake, and then bestowed upon it a kick in which could have emanated from no leg but a beetle's. I don't know what a beetle is. I'm going to look up what a beetle is real quick, although I probably shouldn't be asking my internet to do anything else. What's a beetle? The word beetle has multiple meanings, including a church or university official, a minor civil official, or a former law enforcement officer. I'm guessing it's like the latter. Beetle. Oliver Twist. No, not Twit. Not Oliver Twit. That's the ribald parody that was made by Mad Magazine. Oliver Twit. Mr. Bumble is a fictional bead. Minor church official. I see. Okay. He's a church guy. Mr. Bumble, the church man. Mr. Bumble was a fat man and a choleric one, so instead of responding, I already read all that. Lord, only think, said Mrs. Mann, running out, for the three boys had been removed by this time. Only think of that I should have forgotten that the gate was bolted on one side on account of them dear children. Walk in, sir, walk in. Pray, Mr. Bumble, do, sir. Although this invitation was accompanied with a curtsy that might have softened the heart of a churchwarden, it by no means mollified the beetle. Do you think this respectful or proper conduct, Mrs. Mann, inquired Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane, to keep the parish officers awaiting at your garden gate when they come here upon parochial business connected with the parochial orphans? Are you aware, Mrs. Mann, that you are, as I may say, a parochial delegate and a stipendiary? I'm sure, Mr. Bumble, that I was only telling one or two of the dear children is so fond of you. "That it was you a-coming," replied Mrs. Mann with great humility. "Mr. Bumble had a great idea of this oratorical powers," right? Okay, I know that word. Mr. Bumble had a great idea of his oratorical powers and his importance. He displayed the one and vindicated the other. He relaxed. "Well, well, Mrs. Mann," he replied in a calmer tone, "it may be as you say, it may be. Lead the way in, Mrs. Mann, for I come on business, and I've got something to say." Mrs. Mann ushered the beadle into a small parlor with a brick floor, placed a seat for him, and officiously deposited his cocked hat and cane on the table before him. Mr. Bumble wiped from his forehead the perspiration which his walk had engendered, glanced complacently at the cocked hat, and smiled. Yes, he smiled. Beetles are but men, and Mr. Bumble smiled. "Now, don't you be offended at what I'm a-going to say," observed Mrs. Mann with captivating sweetness. "You've had a long walk, you know, or I wouldn't mention it. Now, will you take a little drop of something, Mr. Bumble?" "Not a drop, said Mr. Bumble, waving his right hand in a dignified but still placid manner. "I think you will," said Mrs. Mann, who had noticed the tone of the refusal and the gesture that accompanied it. "Just a leetle drop, with little cold water and a lump of sugar." Mr. Bumble coughed. "Now, just a little drop," said Mrs. Mann persuasively. "What is it?" inquired the beadle. "Why, it's what I'm obliged to keep a little of in the house, to put into the blessed infant's medicine when they ain't well, Mr. Bumble," replied Mrs. Mann, as she opened a corner cupboard and took down a bottle and a glass. "It's gin. I'll not deceive you, Mr. B. It's gin." "Do you give the children medicine, Mrs. Mann?" inquired Mr. Bumble, following with his eyes the interesting process of mixing. "Ah, bless 'em that I do, dear as it is," replied the nurse. "I couldn't see 'em suffer before my very eyes, you know, sir." "No," said Mr. Bumble approvingly. "No, you could not. You are a humane woman, Mrs. Mann." Here she set down the glass. "I shall take an early opportunity of mentioning it to the board, Mrs. Mann." He drew it towards him. You feel as a mother, Mrs. Mann." He stirred the gin and water. I drink your health with cheerfulness, Mrs. Mann," and he swallowed half of it. Now about business," said the beadle, taking out a leathern pocketbook. "The child that was half-baptized, Oliver Twist, a 9-year-old today." "Bless him," interposed Mrs. Mann, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron, and notwithstanding an offered reward of £10, which was afterwards increased to 20, notwithstanding the most superlative and I may say supernatural exertions on the part of this parish, said Bumble, "we have never been able to discover who is his father or what his mother's settlement, name, or condition." Mrs. Mann raised her hands in astonishment, but added, after a moment's reflection, "How comes he to have any name at all, then?" The beadle drew himself up with great pride and said, "I invented it." "You, Mr. Bumble?" "Aye, Mrs. Mann. We name our fondlings in alphabetical order. The last was S. Swubble. I named him. This was a T. Twist. I named him. The next one as comes will be Unwin, and the next Vilkins. I've got names ready made at the end of the alphabet and all the way through it again when we come to Z. Or Z if you're British." "Why, you're quite a literary character, sir," said Mrs. Mann. "Well, well," said the beadle, evidently gratified with the compliment. Perhaps I may be, Mrs. Mann." He finished the gin and water and added, "Oliver being now too old to remain here, the board have determined to have him back into the house, and I have come out myself to take him there. So let me see him at once." "I'll fetch him directly," said Mrs. Mann, leaving the room for that purpose. And Oliver, having had by this time as much of the outer coat of dirt which encrusted his face and hands removed as could be scrubbed off in one washing, was led into the room by his benevolent protectress. "Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver," said Mrs. Mann. Oliver made a bow which was divided between the beadle on the chair and the cocked hat on the table. "Will you go along with me, Oliver?" said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice. Oliver was about to say that he would go along with anybody with great readiness when, glancing upward, he caught sight of Mrs. Mann, who had got behind the beadle's chair and was shaking her fist at him with a furious countenance. He took the head at once, for the fist had been too often impressed upon his body not to be deeply impressed upon his recollection. "Will she go with me?" inquired poor Oliver. "No, she can't," replied Mr. Bumble, "but she'll come and see you sometimes." This was no very great consolation to the child, but, young as he was, he had sense enough to make a feint of feeling great regret at going away. It was no very difficult matter for the boy to call tears into his eyes. Hunger and recent ill usage are great assistants if you want to cry, and Oliver cried very naturally indeed. Mrs. Mann gave him 1,000 embraces, and what Oliver wanted a great deal more, a piece of bread and butter, lest he should seem too hungry when he got to the workhouse. With the slice of bread in his hand and the little brown cloth parish cap on his head, Oliver was then led away by Mr. Bumble from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lighted the gloom of his infant years. And yet he could burst into agony of childish grief at the cottage gate closed after him. Wretched as were the little companions in misery he was leaving behind, they were the only friends he had ever known, and a sense of his loneliness in the great wide world sank into the child's heart for the first time. Mr. Bumble walked on with little strides, and little Oliver, firmly grasping his gold-laced cuff, trotted beside him, inquiring at the end of every quarter of a mile whether they were nearly there. To these interrogations Mr. Bumble returned very brief, snappish replies, for the temporary blandness which gin and water awakens in some bosoms had by this time evaporated, and he was once again a beetle. Oliver had not been within the walls of the workhouse a quarter of an hour, and had scarcely completed the demolition of a second slice of bread, when Mr. Bumble, who had handed him over to the care of an old woman, returned, and telling him it was a board night, informed him that the board had said he was to appear before it forthwith. Not having a very clearly defined notion of what a live board was, Oliver was rather astounded by this intelligence, and was not quite certain whether he ought to laugh or cry. But he had no time to think about the matter, however, for Mr. Bumble gave him a tap on the head with his cane to wake him up, and another on the back to make him lively, and bidding him follow, conducted him into a large whitewashed room where 8 or 10 fat gentlemen were sitting around a table, at the top of which, seated in an armchair rather higher than the rest, was a particularly fat gentleman with a very round red face. "Bow to the board," said Bumble. Oliver brushed away 2 or 3 tears that were lingering in his eyes, and seeing no board but the table, fortunately bowed to that. "What's your name, boy?" said the gentleman in the high chair. Oliver was frightened at the sight of so many gentlemen, which made him tremble, and the beadle gave him another tap behind, which made him cry, and these 2 causes were made him an answer in a very low and hesitating voice, whereupon a gentleman in a white waistcoat said he was a fool, which was a capital way of raising his spirits and putting him quite at ease. "Boy," said the gentleman in the high chair, "listen to me. You know you're an orphan, I suppose?" "What's that, sir?" inquired poor Oliver. "The boy is a fool. I thought he was," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat, in a very decided tone. "If one member of a class be blessed with an intuitive perception of others of the same race, the gentleman in the white waistcoat was unquestionably well qualified to pronounce an opinion on the matter." "Hush," said the gentleman who had spoken first. "You know you've got no father or mother, and that you were brought up by the parish, don't you?" "Yes, sir," replied Oliver, weeping bitterly. "What are you crying for?" inquired the gentleman in the white waistcoat. And to be sure, it was very extraordinary. What could the boy be crying for? "I hope you say your prayers every night," said another gentleman in a gruff voice, "and pray for the people who feed you and take care of you like a Christian." "Yes, sir," stammered the boy. The gentleman who spoke last was unconsciously right. It would have been very like a Christian, and a marvelously good Christian too, if Oliver had prayed for the people who fed and took care of him. But he hadn't, because nobody had taught him. "Well, you have come here to be educated and taught a useful trade," said the red-faced gentleman in the high chair. "So you'll begin to pick oakum tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, added the surly one in a white waistcoat. Poor Oliver, he had little thought, as he lay sleeping in happy unconsciousness of all around him, that the board had that very day arrived at a decision which would exercise the most material influence over all his future fortunes. But they had, and this was it. The members of this board were very sage, deep, philosophical men, and when they came to turn their attention to the workhouse, they found out at once what ordinary folks would have never discovered. The poor people liked it. It was a regular place of public entertainment for the poorer classes, a tavern where there was nothing to pay, a public breakfast, dinner, tea, and supper all the year round, a brick-and-mortar Elysium, where it was all play and no work. "Oh ho," said the board, working very knowingly, "we are the fellows to set this to rights. We'll stop it all in no time." So they established the rule that all poor people should have the alternative, for they would compel nobody, not they, of being starved by a gradual process in the house or by a quick one out of it. With this view, they contracted with the waterworks to lay on an unlimited supply of water, and with a corn factor to supply periodically small quantities of oatmeal, and issued 3 meals of thin gruel a day, with an onion twice a week, and half a roll on Sundays. They made a great many otherwise inhumane regulations, which is not necessary to repeat. For the first 6 months after Oliver Twist was removed, the system was in full operation. It was rather expensive at first in consequence of the increase in the undertaker's bill and the necessity of taking in the clothes of all the paupers, which fluttered loosely on their wasted, shrunken forms after a week or two's gruel. But the number of workhouse inmates got thin as well as the paupers, and the board were in ecstasies. The room in which the boys were fed was a large stone hall with a copper at one end, out of which the master, dressed in an apron for the purpose and assisted by one or two women, ladled the gruel at meal times, of which composition each boy had one porringer and no more, except on festive occasions, and then he had 2 ounces and a quarter of bread besides. The bowls were never wanting washing. The boys polished them with their spoons until they shone again, and when they had performed this operation, which never took very long, the spoons being nearly as large as the bowls, they would sit staring at the copper with such eager eyes as they could have devoured the very bricks of which it was composed, employing themselves meanwhile in sucking their fingers most assiduously, with the view of catching up any stray splashes of gruel which might have been cast thereon. Boys have generally excellent appetites. Oliver Twist and his companions suffered the tortures of slow starvation for 3 months. At last, they got so voracious and wild with hunger that one boy, who was tall for his age and hadn't been used to that sort of thing, for his father had kept a small cook shop, hinted darkly to his companions that unless he had another basin of gruel per diem, he was afraid he might some night happen to eat the boy who slept next to him, who happened to be a weakly youth of tender age. He had a wild, hungry eye, and they implicitly believed him. A council was held. Lots were cast who should walk up to the master after supper that evening and ask for more, and it fell to Oliver Twist. The evening arrived. The boys took their places. The master, in his cook's uniform, stationed himself at the copper. His pauper assistants, enunciate, buddy, and his pauper assistants ranged themselves behind him. The gruel was served out, and a long grace was said over the short commons. The gruel disappeared. The boys whispered each other and winked at Oliver, while his next neighbors nudged him. Child as he was, he was desperate with hunger and reckless with misery. He rose from the table and advanced to the master, basin and spoon in hand, said somewhat alarmingly at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." Of course I fucked that up. It's like, this is like the most important part. This is it. I'm like, on his own temerity. He rose from the table and advancing to the master basin and spoon in hand, said, God, I can't. Somewhat alarmed at his own temerity, "Please, sir, I want some more." The master was a fat, healthy man, but he turned very pale. He gazed in stupefied astonishment on the small rebel for some seconds and then clung for support to the copper. The assistants were paralyzed with wonder, the boys with fear. "What?" said the master at length in a faint voice. "Please, sir," replied Oliver, "I want some more." The master aimed a blow at Oliver's head with the ladle, pinioned him in the arms, and shrieked aloud for the beetle. The board were sent in solemn conclave when Mr. Bumble rushed into the room in great excitement, and addressing the gentleman in a high chair, said, "Mr. Limpkins, I beg your pardon, sir. Oliver Twist has asked for more." There was a general start. Horror was depicted for every countenance. "For more?" said Mr. Limpkins. "Compose yourself, Bumble, and answer me distinctly. Do I understand that he asked for more after he had eaten the supper allotted by the dietary?" "He did, sir," replied Bumble. "That boy will be hung." "Oh my God," said the gentleman in the white waistcoat. "I know that boy will be hung." Nobody controverted the prophetic gentleman's opinion. An animated discussion took place. Oliver was ordered into instant confinement, and a bill was next morning pasted on the outside of the gate, offering a reward of £5 to anyone who could take Oliver Twist off the hands of the parish. In other words, £5 and Oliver Twist were offered to any man or woman who wanted an apprentice to any trade, business, or calling. Well, my internet's going really cocky foo-foo right now. I don't know why. It's like at 1 bar. I don't even know how this is going to sound. I'm going to watch this afterwards to see how it went. But this freaking book is good so far. It's fucking well. I mean, I decided to do this because after trying to read the histories, I've read it before, so I thought I could read it on here. And it's just far too difficult a book, even if I've already read it before, to try to do in any kind of, way where I'm like a freaking teacher here, and I'm reading it to the class. I'm supposed to maybe not explain things, so much, but just like kind of help along. And it's, it was fucking impossible. I tried to do it for like 10 minutes and I almost died. But what was I saying? Fuck. And I think this book's pretty good for that. It's a good read. Now I remember what I was saying. Because the reason I was thinking this would be a good one is because, I'd read, the only other book I've read by Charles Dickens is A Christmas Carol. I thought it was great. It's like the same thing. It's very well written. The dialogue's great. It's funny. You know, it's a really, really well written book, and this is no different so far. And I told myself a while ago I'm gonna try to read all of Charles Dickens' books. That was quite some time ago, and this is my first, I guess, half an hour. It would seem doing it. So, but it went pretty well, and I'm gonna do it again, and hopefully the internet will be better then. And I can't tell if someone was watching this at all. I don't think they were, but if you were, thank you very much, and we hope you join us next time. But until then, bye.